Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident, confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident at work.
Hello and welcome to episode 123 of the Confident at Work podcast. I'm your host and your confidence coach, Anna Manning. And today we're talking about how to give good feedback to yourself. Most of us want it. Most of us think that it's useful. We want more of it very often. We want it delivered well. We want it to be constructive. We want it to be fair. We want it to be respectful. But what most of us don't realize is that the vast majority of feedback that we get is actually from ourselves. Think about it. Even when you have no boss, no client, no team, no one around you, you have that little voice in your head, which may critically or not so critically give you feedback about the thing that you've just done. Whether that's an interview you've just been in, whether it's a point you made in a meeting, whether it's a piece of work you just submitted. You get a lot of feedback, don't you, from that voice that lives in your head. And for most of us, if we really think about it, that's the vast majority of feedback that you actually get. But do you ever pay any attention to the kind of feedback that you're getting from that little voice in your head? And what impact that might be having on you? The reason that I want to talk about this on the podcast is because I know if you want to be more confident at work, you need to consider the kind of feedback that you give to yourself. You may not really have thought about it much before, but let me tell you, after years of working with professionals on how to build professional confidence, this I know for sure. The kind of feedback that you give yourself and the way in which you give that feedback matters. It matters in terms of your confidence. It matters in terms of your efficiency. And just like when someone else is giving you feedback, it matters in terms of how you learn, how you grow, and how you develop. And I'm going to anchor this topic, like I anchor nearly every topic on this podcast, back to those high and low confidence cycles. So typically when I'm working with someone at the beginning, they're in a low confidence cycle. And if you don't know what I'm talking about here, you can click the link in the show notes and go and find out whether you're in a low confidence cycle or a high confidence cycle. But typically, what my clients, when I start working with them, they're in a low confidence cycle. And this aspect, giving yourself negative, difficult, harsh, rude feedback, is a part of a low confidence cycle. And it makes sense, right? Imagine if all day, every day, you were given negative feedback by your boss. They never really noticed the positives or the stuff that you did well, but they sure as hell noticed all of the stuff that you got wrong. Every moment you stumbled, every little thing that wasn't perfect. And as well as noticing it, they told you about it. They majored on it and they reminded you of it, even at 3 a.m. when you were lying in bed. Imagine what that would do to your confidence. You may have experienced a boss like that. And I can imagine that if you have, it was pretty demoralizing. And if you haven't, just imagine for a second if you had a boss that constantly gave you negative and critical feedback. And to be honest, that was the only thing that they really ever seemed to notice. They glossed over the positives, but they gave you a lot of negative and critical feedback, even negative and critical feedback that was pretty unfair. So let's say you come out of a meeting and you've made 10 points. One of them you stumbled over a bit, the other 9 were fine. But when you came out of that meeting, that boss said, you stumbled a bit over that 9th point, didn't you? That was a bit rubbish. But they didn't say anything about the other points that you made that were great. That to me is unfair feedback because it's very skewed in one direction. It's focused on the negatives, on anything that wasn't perfect, but it doesn't really acknowledge or notice the positives. And you might think, well, that kind of feedback is helpful because I need to know the things that I didn't do well so that I can learn and grow from them. And maybe there's a certain amount of truth in that. But If you had a boss who only ever gave you the negative bit of feedback and never really noticed the positives, I'm not sure how easy it is to learn and grow from that, because what I see when a client is subject to that is that it puts them into this kind of negative cycle where they worry, they overwork, they panic, and they're actually more likely to get things wrong because they're under so much pressure. So, is the feedback that you give yourself fair? Is it balanced in terms of it looks at the negatives, but it looks at the positives and it acknowledges those too? Does it notice the things that you got wrong, but also notice the things that you did really well and got right? Does it devote an amount of time that feels fair to the one thing you got wrong and to the 9 things that you got right? For many of my clients, and maybe for you, the answer to this is that the inner feedback that they get is pretty unfair. So it will tend to major on the negatives and gloss over the positives. It will tend to spend the majority of time thinking about, talking about, ruminating on, reminding you of the one little thing that went wrong in the day, even though lots of things definitely went right. That kind of feedback doesn't really tend to acknowledge the things that you've done well. And it may be that your internal kind of manager, your internal boss, that voice that lives in your head, that doesn't really major on giving you any of the acknowledgement either. But that's part of the kind of feedback that we want, right? And this is worth thinking about. What is the kind of feedback that you feel like you need in order to feel confident at work? In order to be at your best, in order to be at your most effective, in order to grow, in order to develop? What kind of feedback do you need? And how do you need it to be delivered? If you're really going to geek out on this episode, then I suggest you actually write that down, because it's great to be really clear about what you need and how you need it to be delivered. And let's say, for instance, that you said, I need the feedback to be honest, I need it to be straightforward, I need it to be respectful, I need it to be supportive, and I also need it to point out the areas that I did really well and to boost me up. Does the internal feedback that you give yourself align with the kind of feedback that you want, that you need in order to be more confident at work, in order to be your most effective, do your best, lead your team in the way that you want? Does your internal feedback style, if we're going to call it that, match the kind of feedback that you think you need in order to be at your best? And if the answer is no, which for most people listening to this podcast, the answer will be no. And my feedback in the past was definitely the answer was there was no way the feedback I used to give myself matched the feedback I actually wanted. Then we may have a little bit of work to do. And if you're like, actually, no, do you know what, Anna? The kind of feedback that I want is specific and timely and fair and supportive and respectful. And that's the kind of feedback that I give myself. I'm like, great. Maybe you don't need to listen to this episode. Go and do your thing. But if you were like, the kind of feedback that I would like to receive is not exactly the same as the kind of feedback that I give myself, this episode is for you. And I want you to hear me when I say that I have yet to work with a client who didn't have to solve this issue on the way to feeling confident at work. And it makes sense, because if you constantly have somebody, i.e., the voice in your head, giving you negative, damaging, demanding, rude, harsh feedback, it's very difficult to feel confident. Of course, that's going to have a negative, undermining, eroding effect on your confidence. How could it not? If you were constantly being given awful feedback, and that was the only kind of feedback you were receiving, I mean, you'd be demotivated at best, but your confidence at worst could end up completely on the floor. And without realizing it, that is what might be happening for you. You might be undermining your own confidence to such a great degree without really even noticing that that's what you're doing. And it may be that you've experienced in the past somebody giving you this kind of feedback where they only notice the stuff that you got wrong. They only point out to you the areas for improvement, and maybe they deliver it really badly or really harshly. I hope that didn't happen for you, but it might have done. And what I see, and this is a sad but true thing, is that often that kind of manager who ain't great at giving feedback and certainly isn't going to help their team to feel confident can end up kind of living inadvertently in your own head. And they can become the standard for how you deliver feedback to yourself, even though you know really in your heart that that kind of feedback wasn't great for you. It didn't lead to you feeling confident at work. So if you're listening to this and you're like, maybe actually the kind of feedback that I give myself, it tends to focus on the negatives and ignore the positives. It doesn't tend to acknowledge me for the good work that I do, but it really does point out everything that I did wrong. Does tend to kind of ruminate and keep going over things that weren't great. How do you feel when that's what's happening? How does it make you feel? For most people, I reckon they would say, not great. Maybe it's anxiety provoking or worry making. I certainly know that for the people that I work with, it adds pressure for the next time. So let's say you're in a more senior meeting and you're kind of steeling yourself to make the points that you're making. And then afterwards, the feedback is you just get torn to shreds. It was rubbish. It was terrible. You tripped over your words. It wasn't great. You weren't articulate. You didn't come in at the right time, blah, blah, blah. It's going to be even tougher for you to go in there and do what you need to do next time. And I know that you know that logically, but very often people don't really notice that the effect of the feedback isn't just immediate. It has a subtle eroding effect over time, and it increases the pressure, it increases the stress, and it can increase that fight or flight response the next time you're in that situation. So it doesn't actually get easier to do the hard thing, it actually gets harder. That is one of the reasons why good feedback is so critical. It allows you to go into the difficult situation and give it what you've got. And even if there are points for learning, it doesn't have to deliver those with a sledgehammer. It doesn't have to tell you that you're rubbish at your job and they never should have hired you and what the hell were you thinking? Right? That kind of feedback may be the kind of feedback that's going through your head all the time, but it ain't exactly the way you would be delivering feedback if you were trying to boost the confidence of a member of your team, is it? And this is also a good thing to think about. How do you tend to deliver feedback to your team, to the people around you? And again, you might want to write this down. What kind of feedback style do you have? What is important to you when delivering feedback to people? And you may tell me it's important to be direct but kind, notice what people have done well, and give them specific improvement points for how they might do even better next time. So if that's the kind of feedback, or however the feedback naturally that you would deliver, I'm going to suggest that that's probably the kind of feedback which you would need or want. And again, you can compare that to the kind of feedback that you're giving yourself right now. Does it align? If you're like, no way, the kind of feedback I give myself inside my own head, there's no chance I would ever say that to a colleague or a person who worked for me. Then why, my dear, would you be saying it to you? If you would never give the kind of feedback you give to yourself to somebody who worked for you, why not? Why not? And if you did give that kind of feedback to somebody who worked for you, what do you think would happen? How do you think they would feel? How do you think they would react? What do you think would happen over the long term if you were giving them that kind of harsh, critical, difficult feedback every day and never really noticing the things that they did well? What do you expect would happen to that member of your team? Would you say, well, it'll help them to grow and develop? I need to tell them the truth. Or would you say, it's probably going to destroy their confidence and any chance they have of making a success of this job? And if it's the latter, why would you be any different? Another word about this, for those of you listening who have gotten more senior, the more senior you get, typically, in my experience, in the experience of the people that I work with, you tend to get less feedback the more senior that you get. Now, that's a normal thing to have happen. Nothing's gone wrong. That's just the way it is. But this is a danger point if the only feedback that you're actually getting on a regular basis is the feedback from inside your own head. So think about it. You get more and more senior, and the feedback gets less and less. So even if it's good, maybe you get, a couple of times a year, some good feedback, as well as some development points. But every day, or even every other day, you get pretty negative feedback inside your own head. Which one do you think is going to win out? Which one do you think is going to have the most impact? And I see this so often that things get so unbalanced because the vast majority, like 99% of the feedback that my clients are getting when they come to me with their confidence lower than they want is the feedback from inside their own head. And it's not good. And mostly not reflective of the good work that they are actually doing day in and day out. And sometimes they'll tell me, the solution to this is that I need to get more feedback from my boss. I need to know I'm doing a good job, etc. Well, that's great if you can get it, but very often that's just not practical. Very often you can't control how much feedback that you get. And if you're more senior, you usually just have to accept the fact that you are now trusted to get on with what you're doing. And if there's a problem, someone's going to tell you. But if there's no problem, they're probably not going to say anything. But in that scenario, with all that negative feedback that you're getting from inside your own brain, you may start to fill in the gap. And the way I see my clients doing this is they fill in the gap with the negative. So it sounds something like this. If I'm not getting a lot of feedback from my boss, that must mean that I'm not doing a good enough job. And can you hear that there is a big assumption in there? There is a gap in feedback, and that person's brain has filled it in as, and that must mean I'm not doing a good enough job. Well, you can probably hear because you're stepping back, and this might not be you in this scenario, that's a big assumption. It's possible that your boss thinks you're not doing a great job, right? It is possible. I'm not saying that it's not possible, but it's also possible that the job you're doing is fine, or the job you're doing is great, or the job you're doing is absolutely grand. And the amount of feedback that you're getting isn't because of the goodness, that is not a good word, of the job that you are doing. So beware. If the 99% of feedback that you're getting is from your own head and it's very harsh and it's very critical and it's probably very one-sided, so instead of feeling more confident the more senior you get, which you imagine might be the case, you will end up feeling less confident the more senior that you get. I hope you're still with me. And this is not all doom and gloom because there is a way through this. It doesn't have to be like this. Even if you've been giving yourself very critical, very negative, and very one-sided, possibly quite unfair feedback all of your career, it doesn't have to stay that way. It doesn't have to stay that way. It can change. I've watched it change so many times with clients. And when it does change, it will be part of you moving into a high confidence cycle. An intrinsic part of being in a high confidence cycle is fair feedback, acknowledging good work and being able to give yourself praise, and an intentional focus on the positives and progress. Now, that doesn't mean that we become completely blind to development points or say, nothing ever goes wrong with me and we live in a land of daisies and rainbows. No, I'm not into that. But it does mean that you see the reality of the situation. And that means the good as well as the bad and the areas for development. It means being able to notice where you've progressed and where actually you deserve a bit of acknowledgement and a bit of praise. And most of all, that means fair feedback. And again, if you're like, what is she talking about with this high and low confidence cycle? Click into the show notes and click the link to take yourself to the confidence assessment. That is going to ask you a few questions and it will tell you whether or not you're in a high or a low confidence cycle. And if you're in a low confidence cycle, it's going to give you some immediate tools and some insight so that you can figure out how you can get into a high confidence cycle. And you can, believe me, this is not a fixed thing. Even if you're feeling like you're in a really low confidence cycle right now, even if you're not in a low confidence cycle, but you think, actually, the feedback I give myself is probably not the kind of feedback I would want, and it's probably not the kind of feedback I would give, things can change. And when they do, and when you are able to give yourself fair, reasonable, supportive feedback, believe me, you can still learn. You can still progress. It doesn't mean that you become blind to things. I know you'll have this worry because my clients have this worry all the time, that if you stop kind of beating yourself with negative feedback, actually you won't do that well anymore. You probably won't improve. You'll have loads of blind spots. Maybe you'll even become dangerous in the kind of work that you do because you'll be overconfident. But I have to say, that's not how I see it going down. And when you think about this from the external, it's obvious. Did having a boss who gives you fair feedback ever make you too confident, dangerous, and stop you from learning or developing? No, it actually starts you learning and developing because it's part of them creating a safe environment where it's actually okay for you to do that. And having fair feedback on the inside is part of you creating a safe environment for yourself on the inside that you work in, day out. I'll go out on a limb and say, I think you learn more with fair feedback than you do with harsh feedback. And you would probably say to me, if I'm managing someone and I give them fair feedback or I give them harsh feedback, how do I think they're going to learn best, right? You'd probably say to me, I think they'll probably learn best with fair feedback. So I think that you're probably the same. So not only will this fair feedback, when you start giving it to yourself and that becomes your way of doing things and it is routine, not only will that increase your confidence, it will also increase your effectiveness. You will procrastinate less, you will worry less, you will overwork and overprepare less. When you have fair feedback as your standard inside yourself, you are on the way to being in a high confidence cycle and to feeling more confident at work. I kind of hope that's convinced you because I want the people of the world, and I know there's people listening to this podcast all over the world, to be getting fair feedback from themselves. So that's what I have for you this week. If you want to come and work with me, we have 2 ways of working together at the moment, either privately, and that's one-on-one, or as part of the Confident at Work membership. And that's part of a group setting where you have a learning library, a private podcast, training and classes, and group coaching calls, all designed to do one thing: help you be more confident at work. All right. I will see you in next week's episode. Bye.
Confidence, confidence, confident. I can be confident.